Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well on this rainy day. My name is Newton D'Souza, and I'll be presenting this paper with my co-author, Tilanka Chandrasekhara from Oklahoma State University. And this paper follows on from yesterday's discussions about pondering design. Right? We saw papers about what is design, what counts as design. And so this paper is actually getting to the same target but going at in an antithetical way. So asking the question, what is not design? So hopefully it'll help us to get more insights into what is design. So the purpose of the paper is to bring disciplinary clarity to design discipline by asking that question, what is not design? And we know a lot about what is design from the past 30, 40 years of design research. We have seen authors present design as a leap of faith, at one extreme. Christopher Jones talks about it, all the way to very rational kind of reasoning, abductive reasoning, sense making, problem framing, all aspects of what we call as design. And he has an interesting illustration by the architect Daniel Libeskind, looking at design as a choice, as a puzzle that is at the disposal of the designer. And then we also know a lot about nature of design problems over the many years of design thinking research. We know that design is a wicked problem as opposed to a tame problem. There is the co-evolution of problem and solution. We talk about opportunistic solutions. Some people call it happy coincidences that happen in design. And then there's a designerly way of knowing that Nigel Cross talks about, which is different from scholarly or other kinds of knowing. So what we set out to do is look at what is not design, and maybe the best place to start was in a corpus like the Design Studies Journal. So we looked at papers that were written 1985 to 2020 to see whether people have referred to what design is not. And we chose this journal because it's multidisciplinary, it has a long history, and it talks about both opinion-oriented pieces all the way to philosophical musings to empirical research. So we thought this would be a good place to start. And so we started with keyword searches, looking at negative connotations. So we looked at declarative clauses like not design, non-design, design is not, how not to design, design can do, those kinds of things. And phrases like short of design, unlike design, lack of design, design is more than. And we know about these things because anecdotally when we do design reviews with our students, we say this is not design or this is falling short of design. But we wanted to look at it from a scholarly point of view. What do scholars look at? And then we also looked at pre-design and post-design, because if there is a design proper, then people refer to pre-design and post-design issues as well. So we started with those keywords, and then our initial search took us to about 600 papers. We looked at the Elsevier database as well as Google Scholar. And then a lot of it was sifting through because the use of word not or isn't was not used in the reference of design. So we brought it down to the test of relevance. And then we did some open coding and some thematic coding. So it was a little back and forth to look at whether the papers are relevant. And then we came down to about 52 and 10 thematic codes, because one was about finding evidence. When someone says this is not design, we also wanted to see whether there is evidence to what they're talking about, or is it just a one-off sentence, and then we didn't include that. We also didn't, some of them was references to other papers, so it was a lot of back and forth to kind of come to this conclusion. And then at the end, we did a chronological analysis, looking at are there chronological trends based on the year of publication, as well as are there disciplinary trends based on which discipline is talking about not design. So the codes look like this. So if someone talks about design is not simply an act of doing, then we code it as an action kind of code. Or if someone talks about design is not description of what is, but what might be, it's about the question of future and the pointing to future of what the designers do. Or profession, design is not a money-making profession. Some of us might disagree, our students, but so there were some interesting things that came out of that. And then in our more specific coding, thematic coding, we came down to these 10 or 11 codes. And basically, we looked at these codes and also recategorized into more broader codes like nature, product, and design activities. And so I'll be talking about these codes a little bit more detail. And we also looked at, before going in description about these codes, just wanted to look at the broader picture here. And are there any trends coming out of these thematic discussions? So you have the year of publication on the y-axis and the codes on the x-axis. And then basically looking at specific disciplines. Of course, when we looked at disciplines, it was where the author was coming from or where the primary author was coming from. Sometimes you had dual authors, and so we had to make that decision. And then, these were the basic categories. There might be many more in terms of how you categorize disciplines. But is technology a discipline? It's kind of a tricky thing, but there are a lot of papers dealing with technology. So we used this system. And what we saw was majority disciplines discuss about problem solving and technical nature. And that is prevalent throughout the many years of research, which is an interesting finding. Of course, it's not surprising because problem solving has been in discussion for many years. And then, and in computing field especially, we found some statistical significance on that. And then historically, the discussions were on science, art, and problem solving. And then more recently, there is more discussion about social artifacts, products, and technology. And then we looked at disciplinary discussions within specific themes, whether certain disciplines discussed specific themes in more detail. And we found that in some of the fields, there were more kind of discussions across the different years. And then there were more robust discussions after about 2000 or so. And then we didn't find a lot of correlation between discussions between disciplines. And we're hoping that there could be more robust discussions happening when someone is talking about problem solving, let's say in computing, the same discussions would carry over in architecture and other fields. But that didn't really happen. So it felt like these disciplines were discussing about these themes in very isolated fashion. Although, we could find some of those like not technical process kind of issues that went across the board a little bit. So kind of going to the final thematic coding and then looking at each of these, what do we mean when designers say design is not science? And basically the discussion is about, design is about what is yet to be and science is about what exists. And those classical debates that we've had in the past, how designers go from the mind to the world, the scientists go from the mind to the world mapping and designers do a world to mind mapping, and then how science is about knowledge whereas design is about action. And then a lot of discussion is about why design is more than pure artistic creativity, right? So on one hand you say design is not science, then there's that artistic part of it. And there they say you should address a problem, so more of a scientific approach in a way. That design is not just impulsive, habitual, or coincidental. It is really a conscious, selective, and intelligent activity. And that creativity is not just a condition unique to design. Even scientists can call themselves creative. These days we have accountants call them creative. We have creative accountants, and so on. And then there's also interesting discussion that architecture and industrial design is more creative or artistic than engineering and technology, that some of us might take um, issue to that. And then design is also more than problem solving. And there's a lot of discussion about how it's an effective, there's an effective emotional portion of design that goes beyond problem solving. And it's not just utilitarian. And that creation and interpretation is very important for design. And more recently, there's more discussion about how design is a social process, not just a mechanistic process, and that social and cultural values are so important and critical to the role of designers. And then there's also the discussion about how design is not just a series of steps, so a very technical process. It's iterative, there is several ways of doing things, there are alternative solutions, and so on. So it cannot be pinned down to a very linear process. So there's also discussion about the product of design. So what do designers ultimately produce? So there is about discussions about, well, science produces knowledge, that's its main goal. The goal of design is not necessarily to produce knowledge, it's to produce effect. And our knowledge is not as objective, it's bound by social processes. And then designers cannot collect all the information, and they don't have all the knowledge when they begin. There's interesting discussion about problem framing and then how you collect more knowledge during that process. And this is an interesting one where we talk about the product of design is not the artifact itself, but the change that the artifact brings. And there's discussion about what is an artifact and what is a design artifact, and there's discussions of that, which is also kind of controversial. And there's one interesting paper which looked at that artifact is something that does not function, is yet not an artifact. So we cannot call it an artifact because it's not functioning yet in the design process. And that roughness and improvisation, there's discussions about, is an artifact a finished product or is it a rough product? And doesn't necessarily have to be a finished product. And then the final discussions were about design activities. There was a lot of talk about non-design backgrounds. When they say non-design backgrounds, electronics or tool making is considered non-design versus design. Even art is considered not design. And then other fields like law, business, and education is considered non-design. So when we talk about design thinking and how these fields like law and business and education are using design thinking, that means they're dipping into something outside their expertise. So that's an interesting distinction. And then there's also about non-design context. So simulated context, like computer simulated scenarios, is considered a non-design context, which is interesting. And design context is much more rich and real versus simulated scenarios. There's also discussion about software design, and that software design doesn't have context as much as other kinds of design. Again, it's a controversial view of what the context means. And then at the end, we looked at also non-design in terms of social science research and linguistic interpretation was considered a non-design activity. And that was interesting because Andy's paper about linguistic interpretation and how it can really be design-like or design itself. And then there's also a distinction between what is pre-design and post-design. So all the organization of information research assessment is considered pre-design. I also found it interesting that idea generation is pre-design. For me personally, I thought idea generation is design, part of design. And post-design refers to construction administration, post-occupancy evaluation, and those kinds of things as well. So what did we learn from this? So the broader conclusions are the questions about the ethical role of profession. Is it design problem solving? Is it a social activity? Those kinds of questions when it comes to non-design. And then the debates around products of design. and generation of knowledge. As designers, what is our goal in terms of what we produce? In architecture field, from where I come from, we talk about our end goal is, as a product of design, is representations and not the design product itself, because that is done by the builders and others. And then this question of who is a designer, who's a non-designer, the inclusivity and exclusivity of the profession, as some papers talked about yesterday about this whole power difference and expertise and time taken for training. So I think that brings us to that question of where is that boundary? And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.